Okay, so you know how you sent over that presentation, Azure Security Center?
Yeah, yeah,
Yeah.
by Query Dumpster.
Right, query dumpster, exactly. So we
Mhm.
thought, why not just do like a deep dive into that?
For sure. Yeah, sounds good.
Because it seems like it covers, it covers kind of the whole landscape of how to think about security in Azure. And I know that's something that a lot of people are thinking about, now that everyone's moving to the cloud.
Absolutely. A lot of people are concerned with that.
So yeah, so like by the end of this, you'll have a much better idea of, how this Azure Security Center can help bolster your security posture in the cloud.
Yeah, you'll be able to, get a better feel for how you can leverage all these different tools and features in Azure to really amp up your security strategy.
Right, exactly. So let's just jump right in. The first slide is titled uh, Comprehensive Cloud Protection. And the thing that struck me right away was it's not just about Azure, is it?
Yeah, that's a really important point. This first slide, it really sets the stage by saying, hey, Azure Security Center, this isn't just about your Azure environment. This is about everything.
Okay, so it's that broader approach.
Yeah, it wants to give you security for, anything you're running in Azure, of
Right.
course, but also if you're using other clouds or you still have, stuff on premises in your own data center, or you have like a hybrid setup, which a lot of companies do.
Right, it's that hybrid world.
Yeah, exactly. And I think the key takeaway there is, nowadays everything's connected. So if you have a breach in one place, it can easily spread to your other environments.
It can cascade.
Yeah, exactly. So Azure Security Center is really all about, giving you that single view to see everything and manage the risks across all these interconnected environments. So it's a much more holistic approach, rather than having these like isolated security measures in different places.
Right, you got to bring it all together.
Exactly.
Okay, so it's aiming for that unified kind of view. And the slide then lists a few key solution areas. What are the ones that we should really be paying attention to?
Sure. So there's cloud workload protection, which is
Yeah.
all about securing the actual applications and services that you're running in the cloud.
Okay, the actual workloads.
Right. And then you have cloud security posture management, which is kind of like, think of it like regularly checking the locks on all your doors and windows.
Making sure everything is buttoned up.
Exactly. Making sure everything is configured correctly and secure. And then threat intelligence. This is huge, right? Because you need to stay ahead of the bad guys.
They're always coming up with something new.
Always. So it's like having early warnings about new types of attacks so you can prepare your defenses, before they even get to you.
That's ideal.
Yeah, for sure. And then, of course, compliance, especially if you're in a regulated industry, you need to make sure you're meeting all the requirements.
Got to check those boxes.
And then security assessments, that's about proactively identifying weaknesses, before the attackers find them so you can fix them before they become a problem.
That's the best time to fix them.
Right. And the important thing is that all of these things, they work together. It's not like they're just separate silos.
Right, it all integrates.
Yeah, they're designed to integrate seamlessly across your Azure environment, your hybrid environment, and even multi-cloud environments if you're using those. So it's really all about, elevating your overall cloud security, not just focusing on one little piece at a time.
That holistic approach again, right?
Exactly.
Okay, cool. So moving on to slide 2, this one is titled Understanding the Cyber Kill Chain, which sounds kind of like a, foundational security concept.
Yeah, definitely. Think of the cyber kill chain like a roadmap of a cyber attack.
Okay, a roadmap.
It basically outlines the steps an attacker goes through to, to achieve their objective.
Right, and this slide breaks it down into like a sequence of events. So the first one is reconnaissance, what's happening during that phase.
So reconnaissance, that's basically the attacker doing their homework, right? They're gathering information about your systems. They're scanning for open ports. They're trying to map out your network to see, what they can exploit. It's like a burglar casing a joint before they break in.
Right, they're looking for the weak spots, looking for the unlocked window.
Exactly.
So then what happens after reconnaissance?
So the next step is intrusion. That's when the attacker actually manages to get inside your environment.
Okay, they've gotten in.
Yeah, so this could happen through exploiting a vulnerability in your software, or maybe they use malware to get in, or maybe they trick an employee into clicking on a phishing link.
Right, good old-fashioned phishing.
Yeah, phishing is still very effective, unfortunately.
So they're in, what's next?
So once they're in, then comes the exploitation phase. That's when they start actually using the vulnerabilities that they found or the access that they gained to, do some damage. So they might execute malicious code, maybe install backdoors, or try to gain further control over your systems.
Okay, so they're escalating things a bit.
Exactly. And then after that comes privilege escalation. That's when they try to gain even more access. So maybe they started with a regular user account, but now they're trying to get admin privileges.
Right. So they're trying to go from, limited access to basically having the keys to the kingdom.
Precisely. They want to be able to control as much as possible.
And so why is this slide so important? Like, what's the main takeaway for us?
So the main takeaway is that, the attacker has to succeed at every stage of this kill chain to get what they want, but the defender only has to disrupt one stage.
Okay, so they have to win every battle, whereas we just have to win one.
Exactly. And that's why this slide connects those attack stages to our defensive strategies.
Okay, so we need to think about what are the things that we can do at each stage to break that chain.
Exactly. So, for example, strong account monitoring can help you detect suspicious login activity early on, during reconnaissance or intrusion.
Right. Catch them before they get too far.
Yeah, and then network segmentation. That's where you divide your network into isolated zones so that if an attacker does get in, they can't easily move laterally.
Right. Contain the damage.
Exactly. And of course, detecting that lateral movement, if an attacker is trying to jump from one system to another is super important. And then finally, preventing data exfiltration, actually stopping them from stealing your sensitive information. That's like the last line of defense.
Right. Because if they get the data, that's game over.
Exactly. So the key takeaway is that you need a layered defense. Even if they get through one layer, you have other defenses waiting for them.
Right. Multiple layers of security.
And that's how you significantly increase your chances of stopping them, before they can cause any real damage.
So that was slide 2, and now let's move on to slide 3, Azure Security Center overview.
Okay, sounds good.
So this is where we're getting into the specifics of, ASC itself. And the first thing I see is Unified Security Management. What does that really mean for someone using Azure?
Yeah, so Unified Security Management basically means that Azure Security Center wants to be your one-stop shop for all things security in Azure.
Okay. A single pane of glass.
Exactly. It's like a central dashboard where you can see the security posture of all your resources. So your VMs, your databases, your networks, your applications, everything.
And it can extend beyond Azure, right? Like we talked about.
Exactly. And that's the power of it. It can give you that unified view across your entire environment, not just Azure.
So it really helps to reduce the complexity of managing security in the cloud.
Yeah, definitely. Because otherwise you'd be jumping between all these different tools and trying to piece together the information yourself.
Right. So this gives you a much more holistic picture.
Exactly.
Okay. So the slide also mentions joint responsibility, which is a really important concept, but sometimes people get a little confused about what that actually means. Can you break it down for us in the context of Azure Security Center?
Sure. So joint responsibility in the cloud basically means that Azure, as the cloud provider, they take care of securing the underlying infrastructure, like the physical security of the data centers, the network infrastructure, the platform services themselves.
Okay, so that's their responsibility.
Yeah, but you as the customer, you're responsible for securing everything that you put in the cloud. So how you configure your resources, manage access control, protect your data, secure your applications.
So basically, Azure provides the secure foundation, and then it's up to us to build on top of that securely.
Exactly. And that's where Azure Security Center comes in because it helps you fulfill those responsibilities.
Okay, so it gives you the tools and the guidance.
Right. So it helps you with things like network hygiene, making sure your network is configured securely, and it helps you manage security incidents when they happen, by providing alerts and tools for investigation.
Right. And imagine it also helps you to continuously improve your security posture.
Exactly. It gives you those recommendations and insights to help you stay ahead of the bad guys.
Okay, so then there's this term cloud native protection.
Yeah.
What does that mean? Like, what are the advantages of having security built directly into the Azure platform?
Yeah, so cloud native protection basically means that Azure Security Center is deeply integrated with all the different Azure services.
Okay, so it's not just like an add-on, it's baked in.
Exactly, it's part of the platform. So because of that, it can provide very specific security assessments and recommendations, tailored to those services.
Right, it understands the Azure environment deeply.
And that means you get better security because the recommendations are much more relevant to how you're actually using Azure.
Okay, cool. And for anyone who's listening and working in the Azure portal right now, like, how do they actually find Azure Security Center?
Easy. So in the Azure portal at the top, there's a search bar. Just type in Azure Security Center. It'll pop right up, click on it, and you're in.
Couldn't be simpler.
Right? Nope.
And this slide mentions 3 critical security challenges that Azure Security Center is designed to address. So what are those?
Okay, so the first one is reducing your attack surface.
Okay, minimizing those entry points.
Exactly, across all your different environments. So Azure, on-premises, multi-cloud, everything.
Right.
The second one is preventing and quickly detecting attacks.
Okay, so that's both proactive and reactive.
Exactly. You want to stop the attacks before they happen, but you also need to be able to detect them quickly if they do get through.
Right, you've got to have both sides covered.
And the third challenge is improving your security skills, which is a big one these days.
Yeah, there's definitely a skills shortage in the cybersecurity industry.
Huge shortage. So Azure Security Center can actually help with that because it provides you with guidance and recommendations and insights that can help your team learn best practices.
Right, so it's kind of like a built-in security training tool.
In a way, yeah.
Okay, so those are some pretty big challenges that organizations are facing. So let's dive a little deeper into them with slide 4, which is very appropriately titled Key Security Challenges.
All right, let's do it.
So this slide basically expands on those 3 challenges that we just talked about, and it shows how Azure Security Center can help you overcome them.
Yeah, it basically shows how ASC can help you, enhance your security posture,
Yeah.
manage those complex threats, and implement security faster in the cloud.
Right, and it's really that rapid pace of change in the cloud that creates a lot of those challenges.
For sure.
So let's go through each challenge one by one. The first one listed is rapidly changing workloads. And I can definitely see how that's a security problem, right? Things are constantly changing in the cloud.
Yeah, it's super dynamic.
Yeah.
You can spin up resources in minutes. Configurations change all the time. Applications are deployed and scaled rapidly. So it can be really tough to keep track of everything and make sure it's all secure.
It's hard to hit a moving target,
Exactly. And that's why continuous monitoring is so important.
right? You need that real-time visibility.
And that's what Azure Security Center provides. It's constantly monitoring your environment so you can see what's changing, identify misconfigurations quickly, and even, optimize your costs by identifying resources that are underutilized or not configured properly.
Right, so it's not just about security, it's about efficiency too.
Exactly. It's about both.
Okay, so the next key challenge is sophisticated attacks.
Right. And this is a big one because the bad guys are always upping their game.
It's an arms race.
They're using more sophisticated tools, they're automating their attacks, they're constantly scanning for vulnerabilities, and it's just getting harder and harder to keep up.
So our defenses have to be just as sophisticated as their attacks.
Exactly. And that's another area where Azure Security Center can really help because it leverages the power of the Microsoft Intelligence Security Graph.
Right, that massive threat intelligence database.
Exactly. So ASC can tap into that to
Yeah.
identify and block known attack patterns.
Okay, so it's not just relying on your local configurations.
Mhm.
It's got that global intelligence to back it up. And the final key challenge listed here is the security skills shortage, which is a huge problem for a lot of organizations.
Yeah, it's a tough one because there just aren't enough qualified security professionals out there to meet the demand.
And the demand keeps growing.
It does. So one way to address this is by using technology to automate as much as possible.
Right? Let the machines do the heavy lifting.
Exactly. And that's something that Azure Security Center can help with as well.
Okay, so it's kind of like giving your existing security team superpowers.
Yeah, it's like giving them an extra set of eyes and ears.
Right, so they
Yeah.
could focus on the most critical threats instead of being overwhelmed by all the noise.
Exactly.
Okay, so let's move on to slide 5, security center policies.
All right.
So it seems like these are the fundamental rules that guide Azure Security Center's assessments, what it's looking for.
Yeah, exactly. So this slide introduces the concept of policies. And the key takeaway here is that Azure Security Center has a bunch of default policies that are enabled automatically.
Okay, so you don't have to start from scratch.
Nope. You get a lot of security right out of the box.
That's awesome. And what kind of things are these default policies looking for?
So they're looking for things like, missing OS updates, misconfigured network settings, open ports, things like that. Basically, they're checking to make sure that your resources are configured according to best practices.
Okay, and the slide mentions this policy recommendation connection.
Yeah, so this is the really cool part about the policies. When a policy identifies an issue, it doesn't just tell you that there's a problem, it actually gives you a specific recommendation on how to fix it.
Okay, so it's actionable intelligence, not just like a warning light.
Exactly, and it walks you through step by step how to remediate the issue.
Okay, that's really helpful. And if I want to see these policies that are in effect, how do I do that?
So in the Azure portal, you go to Security Center. Then under Management, you'll find Security Policies. Then you select your subscription and click on View Effective Policies. And that'll show you all the policies that are applied to that subscription.
Okay, that's super helpful. And what's the scope of these security controls that are covered by these policies? Like what kinds of things are they looking at?
Oh, it's a lot of stuff. It's a really broad range. So it covers things like system hardening, making sure your operating systems and applications are configured securely. It looks for OS vulnerabilities, make sure you're patched and up to date. It checks your endpoint protection, so antivirus, anti-malware. It looks at disk encryption to make sure your data is protected at rest. It checks your network security, your firewall rules, your web application firewall rules. It can even help you with regulatory compliance.
Wow, so it's really comprehensive.
Yeah, it really is.
Okay, cool. So let's move on to slide 6, security recommendations and secure score.
All right, sounds good.
So this seems to build directly on those policies that we just talked about. It's about how Azure Security Center identifies those security weaknesses
Yeah,
and helps you track your progress in fixing them.
exactly. So it starts with continuous security scanning.
Okay, so it's always running in the background.
Yeah, it's constantly analyzing your environment, looking for vulnerabilities or deviations from best practices.
And when it finds something, it generates one of those recommendations that we were just talking about.
Right, exactly. And those recommendations are prioritized based on their severity.
Okay, so you know what to focus on first.
Yeah, you want to tackle the most critical issues first and then work your way down the list.
Makes sense. And how often does it update those recommendations? Because, things change so quickly in the cloud.
So most recommendations are updated every 24 hours. OS vulnerabilities are checked every 48 hours, and endpoint protection issues are checked every 8 hours.
Okay, so it's staying pretty up to date.
Yeah, for sure.
So then there's this thing called secure score,
Hmm.
which sounds like a really useful metric.
It's basically a single number that represents your overall security posture in Azure Security Center.
Okay, so it's like a grade for your security.
Kind of, yeah. And the higher the score, the better. So it gives you a quick way to see how well you're doing and to track your progress over time.
Right, because as you fix those recommendations, your score goes up.
Exactly.
So it's a good motivator.
Yeah. And it helps you to prioritize your security efforts, focus on the things that will have the biggest impact on your score.
Okay, cool. So moving on to slide 7, brute force attack protection. This is a classic attack, so I'm curious to see how Azure Security Center helps with this.
Yeah. Brute force attacks are definitely still a problem.
They're not going away.
Nope. So this slide explains how Azure Security Center can protect against them. Brute force attacks are basically when an attacker tries to guess your password by trying lots of different combinations.
Right, over and over and over again.
Exactly. They often use lists of common passwords or usernames.
Right, or they just generate random combinations.
Yeah, exactly. So what are some signs that you might be under a brute force attack?
That's a good question.
So one thing to look for is a sudden spike in failed login attempts, from a particular IP address or range of IP addresses.
Okay, so that's a red flag.
Yeah.
So how can we protect ourselves against these kinds of attacks?
So there are a few things you can do. One is to implement strong IP address block lists.
Right. Block the known bad guys.
Exactly. You can also use account lockout policies. So after a certain number of failed attempts, the account is locked out.
Okay, that's a good one.
You can also use VPNs or ExpressRoute to limit the public exposure of your virtual machines.
Right, so they're not directly accessible from the internet.
And of course, multi-factor authentication is always a good idea.
Always a good idea.
It adds that extra layer of security.
Right, it's not just your password anymore.
Exactly. And you should also have complex password policies, to encourage people to use strong passwords.
Right, not just password 123.
And of course, you can limit the number of failed login attempts before lockout.
Right, make it harder for them to guess.
Exactly. So those are some general best practices. But how does Azure Security Center actually help with this?
Right, that's the key question.
So ASC uses the Microsoft Intelligent Security Graph.
That global threat intelligence database again.
Exactly. So it can actually detect brute force attacks in real time by analyzing all those signals and patterns.
Okay, so it's using that global intelligence to protect you.
Exactly.
That's really powerful.
Yeah, it's like having an army of security experts watching over your environment.
Okay, cool. So let's move on to slide 8. Just-in-time VM access.
All right.
This sounds like a really smart way to reduce the attack surface of your virtual machines.
Yeah, definitely. So JIT, or just-in-time VM access, it basically limits the amount of time that those management ports like RDP and SSH are open to the internet.
Okay, so by default, they're closed.
Exactly, and that's the key principle, default state. ports locked. So when you enable JIT Azure Security Center, automatically blocks any inbound traffic to those ports unless it's explicitly authorized.
Right, so unless someone specifically needs access.
Exactly, and that drastically reduces the chances of an attacker, successfully exploiting those services.
Right, they can't exploit what they can't reach.
Exactly, and then when someone does need access, they have to request it through the Azure portal.
Okay, so they have to go through a process.
Yeah, and they have to provide a justification, why they need access and for how long.
And then what happens? Does it get approved automatically?
So you can configure it to require approval from someone else, like a manager or a security admin.
Okay, so there's an extra layer of control.
Yeah, exactly. And once it's approved, the access is only granted for the specific ports requested for a limited amount of time, and usually only from the requester's IP address.
Right, so it's very granular, very controlled.
And then when the time limit expires, the access is automatically revoked.
Okay, so it's like giving someone a temporary key to a specific door.
Exactly. That's a great analogy.
So the key benefits here are, reduced attack surface and, more controlled access.
Right, exactly. And the really cool thing is that you can customize the JIT policies.
Yeah.
You can control which ports can be opened, how long they can be open for, and which IP addresses are allowed to connect.
Okay, so it's very flexible.
Yeah, you can really tailor it to your specific needs.
All right, so we've reached the final slide, slide 9, coming next. Azure Sentinel. It sounds like this presentation was kind of a lead-in to a discussion about Azure Sentinel.
Yeah, exactly. So Azure Sentinel is a SIEM and SOAR solution.
Okay, and what does that mean?
So SIEM stands for Security Information and Event Management, and SO stands for Security Orchestration, Automation, and Response.
Okay, so a lot of acronyms.
Yeah. But basically, Azure Sentinel is a platform that helps you collect and analyze security data from all your different sources, Azure, other clouds, on-premises, your security appliances, everything. And then it helps you automate your response to security threats and incidents.
Okay, so it's like a centralized security hub.
Exactly.
And what are some of the key capabilities that they highlight on this slide?
So they talk about data connections, being able to ingest data from all those different sources. They talk about hunting and response, having tools for security analysts to proactively search for threats and automate their responses. And they mentioned workbooks and playbooks.
Okay, so workbooks, those are like dashboards and reports.
Right. And playbooks are automated workflows that can be triggered by alerts or by the analysts themselves.
Okay, so it sounds like it takes security management to a much more advanced level.
Yeah, it's definitely a more advanced solution.
And it looks like they're going to do a whole separate presentation on Azure Sentinel, so we won't go into too much detail here.
Yeah, we'll save that for another deep dive.
But it's definitely something to keep in mind if you're looking for a more comprehensive security solution.
Absolutely.
All right, so this has been a really great deep dive into this Azure Security Center presentation.
It has. We covered a lot of ground.
We did. We talked about how it provides that comprehensive cloud protection across different environments, not just Azure.
Right, that holistic approach.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And we talked about the cyber kill chain, understanding how attackers work so you can defend against them better.
And we got into the specifics of Azure Security Center, how it provides that unified security management and helps you with your shared responsibility in the cloud.
Right, and all those great features like security policies and recommendations and secure score and brute force attack protection and just-in-time VM access.
It's a lot of stuff.
It is,
Yeah.
but it's all really important for strengthening your security posture in the cloud.
Yeah, the cloud brings so many opportunities, but it also brings new security challenges. So it's crucial to have a solution like Azure Security Center in place.
Absolutely. So for you listening, we've talked about a lot of different aspects of security in the cloud.
Yeah.
So what area do you think would benefit the most from implementing Azure Security Center's recommendations or features?
Yeah, think about your own environment, your own specific needs and challenges.
And see how Azure Security Center can help you address those challenges.
Exactly.
All right, well, thanks for joining us for this deep dive into Azure Security Center.
It was my pleasure.
And we'll see you next time.
See you later. Bye.